One evening, I stepped out onto the balcony to talk to Raghav. The air was sharp with the scent of jasmine and dust. We joked about the time he accidentally wore mismatched boots during training. He laughed, deep and warm. "I miss you," I said. "I miss your voice. And your skin," he whispered. I flushed, instinctively glancing over my shoulder, though I thought I was alone. I didn't realize Vikram was sitting in the study beside the balcony with the window open. He heard every word. The next morning, something shifted, subtly, but I noticed. At breakfast, Vikram looked at me longer than usual, not staring, just holding. I passed him the sugar bowl, and his fingers grazed mine. Maybe it was accidental, but the pause lasted a breath too long. "You and Raghav speak often?" he asked, stirring his tea. "Every night, if possible," I said, smiling softly. He nodded. "That's good. These long separations, they can be difficult." There was nothing strange in his words, yet they lingered. Over the next week, his presence grew more attentive. He started joining me for evening tea. He asked about my hobbies, my views on literature, my childhood memories. Conversations deepened, and I found myself opening up more than I expected. Maybe it was the way he listened, fully, without screens or ticking clocks. One afternoon, we discussed a poem by Tagore. He read it aloud in his rich baritone, and something about the cadence, the longing in the words, made the air feel strangely electric. I brushed it off. I was just starved for company. Anyone would seem intriguing in that stillness. But then came the night I saw him standing at the hallway's end, watching me. I was in my nightgown, brushing my hair, unaware he'd stepped out of his room. When our eyes met, he didn't look away immediately. Only when I turned, heart pounding, into my room. That night, I couldn't sleep. There's a moment, when something forbidden is still unreal, when you convince yourself it's in your head. You want to believe it's nothing, because anything else would demand action. Hard, irreversible action. I didn't tell Raghav. I didn't tell anyone. I convinced myself it was harmless. A look. A moment. Meaningless. But it wasn't meaningless. And deep down, I knew the house no longer belonged only to me and Raghav's absence. Something unnamed had crept in. Watching. Listening. Morning came without a word. When I opened my eyes, the bed beside me was empty. The sheet barely creased. I sat up slowly, the weight of silence pressing on my chest. The fan groaned overhead, shadows dragging across the floor. I didn't mention anything when I passed Vikram at breakfast. Neither did he. Raghav had texted, "Morning. Meeting till 4. I replied with a thumbs up I didn't mean. The hour stretched. I read half a novel without absorbing a word. At lunch, Vikram said, "The electrician is coming. By 4. I'll handle it." I nodded, grateful for the distance. For a moment, I held him and wished time could fold back to a version of me that had never strayed. Vikram emerged from his room soon after, neatly dressed, unreadable. Raghav embraced him warmly. "It's good to be home," he said. I smiled, but something inside me cracked. The first few days were too normal. We ate together, laughed, watched a film. The three of us, seated in artificial ease. But at night, I lay stiffly beside Raghav, unable to meet his touch without flinching. Then, 3 nights in, I stepped out to the terrace for air. When I returned, Raghav was sitting in the study. My journal was open. I froze. "I was looking for a pen," he said. "I found something else." I couldn't speak. The air throbbed with unsaid things. "You wrote that you felt alone," he continued. "That I left you in a house too quiet, too long. That someone else filled that space." He looked up. His eyes weren't angry. They were devastated. "You let him in." "My father." I opened my mouth, but there was no apology that wouldn't sound insulting. "I trusted both of you," he said. "You. My wife. Him. My blood. He walked past me to the guest room. The door slammed shut. I didn't follow. What could I say that wouldn't sound hollow? The next morning, Vikram was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. His room was stripped bare. I found his books stacked neatly in the hallway, as if he had wiped himself away. Raghav didn't speak to me for 3 days. When he finally did, it wasn't to accuse, but to decide. I'm leaving, he said. You can keep the house. I'll speak to a lawyer. Please. Don't, I whispered. We can't, he interrupted. This wasn't a moment. It was a choice. Repeated. Willing. With someone who should have protected our marriage, not dismantled it. His words struck deeper than shouting ever could. He packed in silence. As he loaded his bag into the car, I watched from the balcony, the same place where it all began. I never saw Vikram again. Raghav returned to base. The divorce papers arrived quietly. Without drama. The house is quieter now than it ever was. People talk. His words touched something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. I think I've forgotten what that feels like, I said quietly. He didn't reply. But something shifted between us, a closeness that felt like a door had opened, just a crack. Our hands rested between us, not touching. Not yet. Then, slowly, our fingers brushed. Light, barely there. Neither of us pulled away. My breath caught. I stayed still. So did he. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Just skin on skin. A moment. But deep down, it felt like an answer to a question I hadn't even spoken aloud. I'm sorry, he whispered, voice rough. I shouldn't. It's okay, I said too fast. That was the beginning. The real beginning. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't speak again. But something had changed. The air between us carried it. Our movements became careful. Measured. I stayed frozen in bed for hours, afraid that even one motion would turn quiet thoughts into something we couldn't take back. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of warmth. Not desire, but comfort. The kind that fills empty spaces left hollow for too long. The next morning, after he left the room, I stayed in bed longer than usual. I stared at the ceiling, wondering when the line between right and wrong had blurred, and why stepping over it had felt so natural. I avoided him all day. Not because I was angry. But because I was scared. Scared of what I might see in his eyes, and scared of what I might not. I always believed love could survive distance. I had to believe it. My husband, Raghav, has been in the army for 8 years. We married young, and while duty called him away, I stayed behind, managing the house, tending the garden, and clinging to phone calls that rarely lasted longer than 15 minutes. We spoke every night, regardless of time zones or weak connections. His voice often crackled with static more than comfort, but I held on. I didn't marry the uniform, I married the man who wore it. Raghav was kind, responsible, a little reserved, but there was a softness in him I loved. Still, years of separation quietly stretched the thread between us. It didn't snap, it just thinned. When Raghav told me his father, Vikram, would be staying with me while he was deployed in Kashmir, I agreed without hesitation. Vikram was a retired literature professor, measured, polite, always distant at family gatherings. We had never been close, but I respected him. He had the kind of quiet authority that filled a room without raising a voice. He arrived in early October, just as the heat gave way to Delhi's dry chill. He brought books, a flask of tea he kept refilling, and a silence that settled into the house like a third occupant. At first, we barely spoke. He would read in the living room or walk in the garden while I cooked, cleaned, or stitched clothes to pass the time. I appreciated the company, even if it was wordless. Maybe it was the way he listened, calm and focused, like he truly cared. One afternoon, we talked about a Tagore poem. He read it aloud, his voice deep and smooth. There was something in how he spoke, in the quiet emotion behind the words, that made the room feel different, charged, almost. I told myself it was nothing. I was just lonely. Anyone would seem interesting in a house so quiet. But then, one night, I saw him standing at the end of the hallway. I was brushing my hair, wearing my nightgown, and didn't realize he had come out of his room. When our eyes met, he didn't turn away right away. He finally looked down only after I stepped quickly into my room, heart racing. I lay awake that night, unable to sleep. There's a moment when something wrong still feels far away, where you convince yourself you imagined it. It's easier than admitting something is really changing. Because that would mean making a choice. A hard, final one. I didn't tell Raghav. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself it didn't matter. Just a look. Just a second. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't that simple. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It wasn't just about Raghav being gone. Something else had entered. Something I didn't name. But it was there, watching. Waiting. The next morning, he was already up. The bed beside me was cold. The sheet on his side of the bed was barely touched, like he hadn't let himself fully rest there. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of silence pressing down on my chest. The ceiling fan creaked above me, sending slow, turning shadows across the floor. When I saw Vikram at breakfast, I didn't bring it up. Neither did he. Raghav had sent me a quick text that morning, just said he'd be in meetings until 4. I sent back a thumbs up emoji, though I didn't really mean it. The day dragged on. I started reading a novel but couldn't focus. I turned pages without absorbing anything. At lunch, Bikram said, "The electrician is coming. By 4. I'll handle it." I nodded, glad to have a reason not to be around him. But later that evening, he told me the repairman had cancelled another outage somewhere in the city. "It'll be tomorrow now," he said, not meeting my eyes. My pulse quickened. "You can sleep here again," he added after a pause. "If you need." This time, he looked at me. Just for a moment. That night, the air in the room felt heavier. The fan overhead groaned louder than usual. I lay on my side, facing away from him. We didn't talk. But the silence was thick, full of things we hadn't said. I felt the mattress shift slightly when he moved. His breathing was steady, slower than mine. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My body stayed alert, tense. A few minutes passed. Then I heard him sigh. "You ever wonder," he said in a low voice, "what it's like to feel truly seen again?" I turned to look at him. "Seen?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Not just noticed or acknowledged. But understood. For who you are." The divorce papers arrived quietly, without drama. The house is quieter now than it ever was. People talk, they always do. Neighbors whisper, though none of them know the truth. They only see fragments, a woman alone, a husband who vanished, a father-in-law who disappeared just as abruptly. But I know what they don't. I know that love, when neglected, doesn't explode, it rots slowly from the inside. I know that desire doesn't always come thundering in with clarity, sometimes, it enters with a whisper, a glance, a moment when you're too tired or too hollow to push it away. And betrayal? It's not just one choice. It's a slow, quiet erasure of everything you once vowed to protect. I thought I had been abandoned. But the truth is, I was the one who opened the door and let the emptiness in. And worse, I fed it. If Raghav ever reads this, I hope he knows I still hear his voice in the quiet. That I never stopped loving him. I just stopped loving myself long enough to lose everything else. And that is the true cost of what I did. This story is not a justification, it's a reflection. It is shared not to elicit sympathy or judgment, but to confront the quiet unraveling that can happen in the silence of our lives. Sometimes, the most profound truths are the ones we are most afraid to speak aloud. If this story resonated with you, may it remind you that even in our darkest choices, there is room for reckoning, and perhaps, redemption. Thank you for listening, for holding space for a story that is raw, uncomfortable, and honest. To those who have experienced the complexity of love stretched too thin, and to those who've lived with regrets that echo louder than apologies, thank you for your empathy. And to the countless unnamed women and men who carry their private heartbreak in silence, your pain matters. Your voice matters. Disclaimer. This story is based on real events, but names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. The intentions behind this narration are personal and reflective, not prescriptive. This is not a moral blueprint, but one person's truth as they experienced it. Listener discretion is advised, and we encourage you to seek support if themes of emotional conflict or betrayal feel triggering. I always thought love could survive distance. I had to believe that, because my husband, Raghav, has been in the army for 8 years. We got married young, and while his job kept him away, I stayed behind, taking care of the house, the garden, and waiting for the short phone calls we managed to fit in. We talked every night, no matter the time difference or the weak signal. His voice often came through more static than sound, but I still held on to every word. I didn't fall in love with the soldier, I fell in love with the man. Raghav was gentle, steady, a little quiet, but he had a kindness in him that always drew me in. Still, the years apart had worn us down in ways we didn't fully notice. The bond wasn't broken, just stretched thin. When Raghav told me his father, Vikram, would be staying with me while he was deployed in Kashmir, I agreed without thinking much. Vikram was a retired professor, polite, calm, and always a bit distant during family get-togethers. We were never close, but I respected him. He had a way of carrying himself that made people take notice, even when he didn't say much. He arrived in early October, when the air in Delhi started turning cool. He brought along a stack of books, a metal flask he kept refilling with tea, and a stillness that made the house feel different. At first, we didn't talk much. He would sit quietly reading in the living room or take slow walks in the garden. I kept myself busy cooking, cleaning, and sewing. Having him around gave the house some life again, even if we didn't say much to each other. One evening, I stepped out onto the balcony to call Raghav. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of jasmine and dust. We laughed about a silly memory, how he once wore 2 different boots to training by mistake. I told him I missed him. I missed hearing his voice. I miss your skin, he said softly. I blushed, glancing over my shoulder, sure I was alone out there. Or at least, I thought I was. What I didn't know was that Vikram had been sitting in the study next to the balcony. The window was open. He heard everything. The next morning, something felt different. It was subtle, but enough to catch my attention. At breakfast, Vikram looked at me a little longer than usual. He wasn't staring, exactly, but it was like his gaze lingered. I handed him the sugar bowl, and his fingers touched mine. Maybe it was by accident, but the touch stayed a moment too long. Do you and Raghav talk often? He asked, stirring sugar into his tea. Every night, if we can, I replied with a soft smile. He nodded. That's good, he said. These long separations, they can be hard. His words weren't unusual, but they stayed in my mind. Over the next few days, he seemed more present. He started joining me for evening tea. He asked about my interests, what I liked to read, and stories from my childhood. I found myself talking more than I expected. But that night, the repairman cancelled, another power surge elsewhere in the city. Tomorrow now, Vikram said, not looking at me. My pulse tightened. You can sleep here again, if you need. His eyes met mine for just a second. The air that night was heavier than before. The fan struggled louder. I lay on my side, back to him. We didn't speak. But the silence wasn't clean this time. It carried everything we hadn't said. I felt the mattress dip when he shifted. His breathing, steady. I closed my eyes, but I stayed alert. Then came a sigh. You ever wonder, he said, barely whispering, what it would be like to feel seen again? I turned toward him. Seen? Yes, he said. Not watched. Not acknowledged. But recognized. For who you are. His words struck something soft in me. I think I've forgotten what that feels like, I murmured. He didn't respond. But something hung in the air, like a door left ajar. Our hands rested between us. Not touching, until they did. A slow, accidental brush. Neither of us pulled away. My breath caught, but I didn't move. He didn't either. I told myself it was nothing. Skin grazing skin. But it felt like an answer to a question I hadn't dared ask. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't, it's okay, I said, too quickly. That was the real beginning. We didn't kiss. We didn't speak again. But the room knew. The air changed. Our distance became measured, calculated. I stayed still for hours, afraid that any movement might turn thought into action. When I finally slept, I dreamt of warmth, not passion, but comfort. The kind that fills spaces left hollow too long. The next morning, I lingered in bed after he left. I stared at the ceiling, wondering where the boundary had gone, and why it felt so easy to cross something I once thought unthinkable. I avoided him all day. Not out of anger, but fear. Fear of what I might find in his eyes. Fear of what I might not. That evening, Raghav called. Heading home early tomorrow, he said. Thought we could go out, maybe catch dinner. I said yes. My voice didn't shake, but something inside me did. That night, the AC was fixed. Vikram wouldn't need to return. Still, as I climbed into bed, I found myself listening for footsteps that never came. I told myself this was better. Clean. Right. But the sheets still carried a scent that wasn't mine. The days before Raghav's return felt suspended in fog. Every corner of the house felt tighter. The air, heavier. I cleaned obsessively, as if scrubbing floors might erase what had happened. But no bleach can sterilize memory. Vikram grew quieter. Whatever heat had once flared between us had cooled into something stiff and unspeakable. He no longer brushed my hand. He avoided my eyes. I think we both realized, too late, that desire cannot survive exposure. And guilt doesn't need light to grow. Raghav arrived on a Sunday morning, early, smiling, sunburned from drills. He wrapped me in his arms, the scent of dust and pine clinging to his uniform.